Ledger Fabric already. Excellent, good. So I will go quite quickly. How many of you know about Hyperledger Composer? Wow, that's really good. Thank you very much. Very good. So, next slide please, Paul. So what we set out to do with Hyperledger Composer was make building blockchain applications really easy, right? So we wanted to essentially open it up to the vast majority of corporate developers, if you like, or the kind of developers that would work for a global SI. Because if you're a large corporation like IBM, over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be doing hundreds of blockchain projects. Right? So we need a repeatable process, a repeatable set of tooling that allows us to take that army of consultants we have and deploy them onto these projects. So, you know, with all due respect, that means they can't learn a new programming language. Right? It's not realistic that they're all going to learn Solidity, for example. And it's not really realistic that they're all going to learn Go either. We need to make this really easy. As the gentleman from EOS said earlier, we need to make it like web development. And that's what we set out to do with Composer. The other thing that we need to do is we make things easy by abstraction, right? That's how the human brain organizes things. You know, we have this sort of layer cake of abstractions. And when we're building a business network based on blockchain, you know, maybe we're doing supply chain or something, it's a lot easier to model that problem if I'm not thinking in terms of a key value store or, you know, raw transactions on the blockchain. I really want my consultants to be thinking in terms of a business network, right? There's a thing, right, that we need to model and deploy. It has a life cycle. There is this thing, the business network. And within that business network, we've got some key kind of models. There are models for the assets that are traded over that business network. And there are participants in the business network. So they could be people or they could be companies. And the way that they trade assets is by sending transactions. So a big part of the Composer programming model is actually to manifest all those things. So that when my business analyst arrives, you know, with the 50-page spec for how he wants the supply chain to work, it's pretty easy to map from that document into something that actually runs, something that executes. I don't have to take this kind of, do this mental gymnastics to transform, okay, he's talked about an asset which is a shipping container, and that means I need to have 15 keys in a key value store, you know, and choreograph how they're updated and who has access to those keys. There needs to be like kind of a smooth mapping, mental mapping from the business concepts to the implementation. We do a lot of that. And, you know, as the great presentation from EOS said, you can think of it as kind of an operating system, app dev, sort of split. So Composer is designed to run on any blockchain conceptually. Right now we run on top of Fabric, but we also have runtimes for Node.js and even inside the web browser. So a Composer solution can run as a standalone Node process for unit testing, or it can run interactively in a web browser, or it can run on a deployed multi-node Hyperledger Fabric. But we don't sort of conflate those two things. The app dev tier, the Composer tier, is pretty separate from the Fabric tier. So Composer deploys to Fabric, but it's not Fabric. Right? There's an operating system which deals in key value stores and consensus and finality and immutability. That's all dealt with by the 100-odd maintainers for Fabric. And then there's the app dev platform that's, and we have like 20-odd committers working on the app dev piece. But they're two separate projects. Next slide, please, Paul. This is what I just said. It's, typically we deploy to Fabric, right? A multi-peer, permissioned, distributed ledger. Next slide, please. The other thing that we saw when we looked at a bunch of Fabric solutions is that a comparatively small amount of the code was actually interesting. Most of the code that people were writing was really quite boring, kind of boilerplate, IT gunk, moving stuff from one place to another, validating the format of stuff, dealing with errors, exposing the network to remote consumers. So what the framework does is it essentially takes a lot of this stuff, the burden of this stuff off you. Right? So you do some setup work to model your assets, participants, transactions, and then because you've done that work of modeling those things, you get all of these things essentially for free. Right? So you can do declarative access control, declarative query. It's automatically exposed as a REST service. You get a lot back because you're dealing with a framework, right? A higher level of abstraction. Next slide, please. So if you wanted to net it down, a lot of it is about time to value, right? I've got this blockchain problem. Maybe I've got to coordinate something across 5 different banks. We know the assets that we want to put on the distributed ledger. We know who the participants are. We can have a conversation about the access control for each participant. We can have a conversation about what are the transactions that update the state of the ledger. And we can go from that conversation to something that's running in a pretty short space of time. So that's the key business value. Next slide, please. So as I said, the modeling is pretty important. You're storing this data on a ledger. You need to know what you're storing, right? But it has to have some form of a schema, because it's probably going to be there for decades to come in some cases. So you model the structure of assets, participants, and transactions. And because you've done that work, we can serialize them to JSON. We can validate the data conforms to the schema. We can expose them as REST services. We can write access control rules over them. We can query them from within chain code or from outside the system. And we can write transaction processing functions over them. So that's what we call chain code or smart contracts. Much less sexy name, but much more descriptive. These are hunks of procedural code that process transactions. Stored procs, whatever you want to call them, right? It's the same old, same old. It's lots of procedural code. Don't be fooled by what some of the snake oil people are trying to sell you. So we made the somewhat contentious decision to decide to express this procedural code in JavaScript. And the reason we did that is because A, it's the most popular language, right? So it's democratic. You can come and write a solution in Composer from the web interface all the way back to the blockchain in a single programming language. And that's quite attractive, right? We don't have to teach all of these people a brand new programming language just because they're expressing procedural logic that happens to run on a blockchain. And it's an amazing ecosystem. Love it or hate it, the JavaScript ecosystem evolves at a pace that I have not seen in any other language, which has its upsides and its downsides, right? There's 15 frameworks for every problem in JavaScript. If you want to run Go code in a JavaScript VM, you can, right? If you want to run C on JavaScript, you can. Pretty much every there's a mad person somewhere that has implemented something on JavaScript, right? And I'm sure the web ASM stuff will obviously be heavily influenced by JavaScript. Next slide, please. So in that spirit of kind of attracting the new developers, right? Our target persona is a guy who's maybe got 2 years experience coming out of college. He's done a bunch of programming, probably mostly web-oriented. We want to build a tool set that feels familiar to him. So you model your data in the Composer modeling language. That's something that we did have to build and define ourselves because there are no existing schema languages that are sufficiently kind of blockchain aware for our purposes. You write your business logic in JavaScript. You can test all of this logic on the web with zero install. So I don't know if you've used the Swift playground, but it's that kind of feeling, right? I can get started on a web page, zero install, very interactive. build my models, test my models, submit transactions, all in a web environment. Once I start building a real application, I'm going to be using JavaScript client libraries. Those are published to the Node package manager, so it's a one-line app to install them and require them into my app. They're all versioned in the Node package manager. We provide plugins for Visual Studio Code and Atom, which are the two very popular code editors in the JavaScript community. A CLI utility, which is published to NPM for the ops people, so they can manage these networks, deploy them, update them, etc. And then a key kind of point of friction that we saw when we looked at these blockchain projects was that actually, having the ledger there on its own is not useful, right? You need to get transactions onto the ledger, and you need to be able to scrape data and get it off the ledger. So we also spent a lot of work, did a lot of work around how do we integrate a Composer blockchain solution with existing systems of record, which is obviously something that large corporations deal with a lot. The transactions are going to be flowing in through their ERP system or through some existing system that is running within the bank. So we use the open source loopback framework to bind this Composer solution and expose it as a REST service. And we use the Yeoman code generation framework so that after I've modeled my business network, I can run a code generator and we generate an Angular application to interact with that business network. And the Angular application is kind of ugly. It's a starting point, right? It's a skeleton. But at least as a mobile developer, I've got a starting point. I don't have to go learn a bunch of blockchain mumbo jumbo to build a nice user interface to my blockchain-based solution. Right, so it's kind of a separation of roles there. The generated code uses the REST API, which is dynamically generated from your business network. Next slide, please. So very, very quick demo. I'm not going to be coding, I promise. But one of the things that we have done, which is I think is very important in terms of getting adoption, is that we've published a pretty slick demo application that's all open source. And it's around the life cycle of the vehicle. So this is, where's it gone? I shall give you a very brief intro to this, but most people know about vehicles, and they intuitively know that there's a lot of different parties are involved in the life cycle of a vehicle. Right? There's Mike, who works for IBM Logistics, who might have manufactured the vehicle. There's Paul, who's buying the vehicle. There's Debbie, who works for the DVLA, who has to register the vehicle and check for fraudulent vehicles. There's the police, who might be interested in stolen vehicles. The insurer, all vehicles on the road have to be insured, etc. So it's kind of it's an interesting use case to talk about multi-party permissions networks in this case. So the demo really is interested in Paul, who's buying a car, Mike, who works for a logistics company who's going to manufacture the car, and Debbie, the regulator, who's going to look at those registered vehicles that are on the road. So we have built a UI for each of them. So the story starts with Paul, who wants to purchase a vehicle. So let me refresh that. So this is an Ionic app, so it runs on your iOS device, your mobile device. I'll just preview it in a browser. So you can imagine we had sort of Tesla in mind here, right? This is a completely digital buying experience for this vehicle. So I'm going to purchase a car and customize it. I'm going to get it in Sunburst Orange with Papyrus and the tinted windows, because that's the way I roll. And then Paul requests, the car. And what we should see is that we've just created a transaction on the blockchain, and the manufacturing UI is listening for those blockchain events, and the manufacturing dashboard has just been updated to show that we have this new the request for a vehicle has come in.
Can you make it a bit bigger?
I
please?
can try. Is that better? Let's see here. So we see that the orange vehicle that I just ordered is in the kind of order received state, and then we wanted to simulate that ERP process, right? The vehicle is going to roll through the factory floor. We may have IoT sensors as it's moving across the factory floor. Each of those IoT sensors will be generating transactions which go up to the blockchain, so that everyone in that business network knows exactly the stage of the vehicle as it moves through the manufacturing process. So when I press the Start Manufacture button, we're going to basically kind of every 5 seconds or so, we're going to step through that simplified manufacturing process. And those transactions are being brokered using some open source integration technology called Node-RED, which kind of is a stand-in for Mule, IIB, MQ, you name your messaging solution of choice. But in a real-world scenario, this is where you would sit your existing SAP or your ERP system, right? And as those transactions get emitted to the blockchain, you can see that the dashboard gets updated, but you can also see, I hope, that Paul has also been updated. So he's getting real-time visibility into his car being ordered. If we just stop there, it's not a very interesting blockchain use case, right? We would have built that with a relational database or a NoSQL database, because it's just Paul and the manufacturer. You don't need a blockchain for that. You shouldn't use a blockchain for that. Where it becomes a bit more interesting from a blockchain point of view is when we bring in the regulator, right? The regulator needs to know all the VIN numbers for all the vehicles that are on the road. So Debbie, who works for the regulator, she has her own regulatory dashboard, and you can see those blockchain transactions as they're coming in, and they're flowing in, to Debbie's view of the world. And she can even start to run some analytic reports on, what vehicles do we have on the blockchain that are suspicious and require a bit more attention. Right. So to bring it back down to Composer, we're able to build a solution like this with Composer in a pretty short space of time, right? With reasonably skilled people. Right? Most of the effort goes into defining the business logic that runs on the blockchain. That was 2-3 days, I'd imagine. And then there's a bunch of time went into actually building the nice UIs and using the designers to build the UIs. So I'm going to stop there because I'm going to hand over to Paul now. Yeah, who's going to just tell us a little bit about how we work with the Hyperledger community in general.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dan. Okay, so I'm Paul Money. I've had called to work with the first, if you like, beta for what was known as Fabric Composer. As Dan said, it's now Hyperledger Composer. So we ran that from February all the way through, and because obviously it's open source, you could argue that it's a continuous beta, which it is. So my role and my call to action really is to try and get more people. You can go on to the next slide, by the way. More people interested in actually trying out Composer, and that's really the template we want people to drive, is to actually start using it. And when you obviously in time come to our website and visit the documentation, for example, and look at some of the tutorials that we've done, understand some of the sample networks, sample applications, and so on, all that's well and good. But from your own point of view, it would be better that obviously you look to try it out, download it, install it, and try building your own Composer use case, because really that's the test in your environment, in your deployment experiences from your perspectives. How does Composer shape up? And that's what we would really like to know. And to that end, today we have various means where people communicate with us, such as Rocket Chat, obviously through various other methods, the standard methods, even at meetups hopefully in time. We've had various sessions where we've been interacting with the community. And obviously what we'd like is people to continue to join the community and give more feedback with the end game to improve Composer. And that's really what it's all about. So the call to action is, firstly, to try it out. Or if you're somebody who's going to be sitting here in proxy for somebody back at base, who is a developer, for example, because obviously Composer is a development tool set aimed at developers primarily, although it has code also for business analysts and architects too, and you'll see that in time. Really is to understand the developer experience and how quickly you can get going and to accelerate the development experience in writing blockchain applications. To point out alone that obviously it's great for us to help to read them and understand there's at least 16, we've had 674 members and many other meetups worldwide. So from our point of view, meetups is, if you like, one string to the bow of trying to get people to consume Composer. If you go on to the next slide. So just some general download stats, not really to impress or anything, but quite a lot of people are downloading it. Some of the stats, which we can just quickly flit over. If you go on to the next slide. Again, these will be shared with you, so if you can't find them easily from Google, we'll share this material with you anyway, so you can go straight to the links. But suffice to say that there's obviously a download site, documentation site. We encourage you to join the community, and you can do that either in Rocket Chat, or indeed you can also, on the next slide, there's a link to join us on the community calls, which are held weekly, and we host them on Zoom. There's no access codes or anything, you just click on the URL and you're in. And what we do every week is we have discussions about impending changes, new features. People come on the calls and explain what their use case is with Composer and give us 5 minutes of the time and explain some of the things they're trying out. Another really, if you like, golden source of use cases and feedback is when we're a Rocket Chat, because people tell us some of the things they're trying out. And again, Composer needs to understand any of the issues they face. So with that, so if you go to our website, we've got a host of different tabs that you can access, and we'd encourage you to try out some of the tutorials just to get started. Dan has already talked about a skeletal commodity app, which allows you to stand up an Angular 2 app and actually look at something that is able to commit transactions to the blockchain within 45 minutes, for example. That's it. Some further links, and it will be great if you joined our weekly calls. Thank you very much. If there are any questions?
Yeah, any question? I don't know how much time we have. Yep.
Yeah, quick question. Do you recommend this for production use, or is it for prototyping?
No, it's for production use.
And what happens to that business model?